That day was the craziest, but yet most intimate and exciting night of my life. It started like any other family gathering, the kind that we've all been to dozens of times before. My sister Claire had organized a little celebration for her youngest, Dylan, who had just turned 18. The house was filled with chatter, laughter, and the clinking of silverware as people helped themselves to slices of cake and refills of drinks. Dylan had always been a quiet kid, but over the last year, he'd grown into himself, taller, more confident, and surprisingly charming. The house was buzzing, guests mingling, and Dylan was making his rounds, thanking people for their gifts. My husband Greg was in the living room with my brother-in-law, drinking beers and discussing something to do with football, while I found myself drawn to the kitchen for a moment of quiet. The kitchen was a sanctuary in that house. I'd always loved it. The big windows let the sunlight spill in, making everything feel warm, comfortable. I busied myself, washing a few dishes that had piled up, the hum of conversation and laughter muffled behind the walls. But as I wiped my hands dry and glanced around the room, I heard footsteps behind me. "Hey, Aunt Jules." I turned to see Dylan standing at the door, an almost shy smile on his face. "Oh, Dylan, how's the birthday boy?" I teased, giving him a soft punch on the arm as he stepped closer. He chuckled, leaning against the counter beside me. "I'm good. It's a bit overwhelming, though. I guess I'm not used to all the attention." There was something different about him, I noticed then. His eyes, the way they lingered a little longer than usual, or maybe it was the way he stood closer than he normally would. I brushed the thought away, chalking it up to him just being more grown up than I remembered. We chatted casually for a few minutes, talking about his plans now that he'd graduated from high school, his summer job at the local coffee shop, and his hopes for college in the fall. But there was an underlying tension in the air. Maybe it was just my imagination, but something felt off. Still, I ignored it, thinking nothing of it. Then, as we were about to head back to the living room, Dylan shifted his weight, his voice taking on a quieter tone. "Aunt Jules, can I tell you something?" I paused. There was something in his voice that made me stop and look at him properly, really look at him. His eyes weren't those of the shy boy I'd watched grow up. They were intense, almost troubled. "Of course, Dylan. What's on your mind?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his younger days when he used to get nervous before asking for something big, like an expensive toy or staying up late on a school night. It's something I've been keeping to myself for a while. I don't know who else to talk to about it," he said, glancing down, avoiding my gaze. My stomach twisted slightly with concern, but I tried to keep my voice light. "Dylan, you can talk to me about anything, you know that." He nodded, but didn't speak right away. For a moment, it seemed like he was struggling to find the right words. Then he looked up, and the seriousness in his expression made my heart race. "Aunt Jules, it's you." I froze, not understanding what he meant at first. "What do you mean?" He took a step closer, his voice low, almost a whisper. I've been in love with you for a while now. I didn't know how to tell you, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." The ground felt like it had shifted beneath me. My breath caught in my throat, and all the sounds from the other room seemed to fade into a dull hum. This wasn't happening. Dylan, my nephew, the boy I'd babysat, helped with homework, and watched grow up, was standing in front of me, telling me he was in love with me. "Dylan," I finally managed, my voice shaky. "You don't know what you're saying." But he didn't back down. His eyes stayed locked on mine, full of a sincerity that both terrified and confused me. "I know exactly what I'm saying, Aunt Jules. I've been thinking about this for a long time. I didn't want to make things awkward, but I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I've felt this way for a while." I couldn't speak. My mind raced as I tried to process his words, tried to find a way to respond. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. I shook my head, taking a step back, putting the counter between us. Dylan, this isn't right. You're confused. I'm your aunt, for God's sake. I know how it sounds, he said, his voice soft but insistent. But I'm not a kid anymore. I'm 18, and I know what I want. The look in his eyes, the way he spoke, it unnerved me. This wasn't some childish crush that would blow over. He meant every word, but I couldn't let it continue. I had to stop this before it went any further. Dylan, you have to understand, I began, struggling to find the right words. This is wrong. Your family. You're like a son to me. You need to move on from this, okay? He didn't move. Instead, he looked down, his expression clouded with pain, and for a moment, I felt an ache in my chest. But this wasn't about me. This was about stopping something that should never have started in the first place. But even as I said those words, I knew. This wasn't over. I thought once I told Dylan to move on, it would be over. That he'd take a few days to clear his head, realize it was just a fleeting emotion, and we'd return to normal. But I was wrong. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next few days were strange. Dylan didn't come around as much as he usually did. We'd always been close, even after he grew older. He would drop by the house for dinner or call me if he needed advice on something. But after that conversation in the kitchen, he disappeared, and his absence left an odd emptiness behind. Still, I thought it was for the best. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he needed space to come to terms with what had happened. I figured time would help him sort out his feelings. But then one evening my phone buzzed. It was a text from Dylan. Can we talk? Please? I stared at the screen, my heart thudding in my chest. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend nothing had happened. But another part of me felt an obligation, as his aunt, to help him through this, to set things right. After all, family didn't turn their back on each other in tough times. Against my better judgment, I replied, okay, come over tomorrow. 7 p.m. The next day passed in a blur of nervousness. I couldn't concentrate at work, and when I got home, I found myself anxiously pacing the house, wondering what I'd say when he arrived. Greg, oblivious to the storm brewing in my mind, had gone to a friend's house for the evening to watch a game. That left me alone with my thoughts, and soon, with Dylan. At exactly 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. My pulse quickened as I walked to the door, forcing myself to stay calm. This was just a conversation, I reminded myself. Just a chance to clear the air and help Dylan move past whatever this was. But when I opened the door and saw him standing there, something felt different. He wasn't the awkward, unsure boy I'd spoken to in the kitchen. His posture was confident, his gaze steady, and there was an intensity in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. Hey, I greeted him, my voice shaky. Hey, he replied, stepping inside. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension between us that hung thick in the air. I led him to the living room, where we both sat down, a coffee table between us. The silence was suffocating, and for a moment, neither of us knew where to start. Then, Dylan broke it. Aunt Jules, I've been thinking about what you said, he began, his voice soft but sure. I've tried to forget what I feel, like you told me to, but I can't. I opened my mouth to interrupt, to tell him this was crazy, but he raised his hand, gently cutting me off. Please, just listen. Reluctantly, I nodded, though every fiber of my being screamed for me to put an end to this conversation before it went too far. I know this is wrong. I know you think I'm confused, that this is just a phase, but it's not. His eyes were locked on mine, unwavering. I've been in love with you for a long time. This isn't something that just popped up yesterday. I've thought about it, fought against it, and tried to move on, but I can't. My heart raced. Dylan, you're only 18. You've barely started living. These feelings, they'll change. They always do. He shook his head, his expression serious. I'm not a child anymore. I know what I want, and I'm not going to run away from it just because it's complicated. His words stunned me. Dylan had always been mature for his age, but this was different. There was a gravity to his tone, a certainty that unsettled me. I had expected him to be awkward and confused, but instead, he was calm, determined. This isn't just about what you want, I said, my voice firmer than before. There's more at stake here. I'm your aunt. We're family. This can't happen. I know it's complicated, he replied, his voice steady. But you can't tell me you don't feel something too. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment I was paralyzed, unsure of how to respond. And that pause, that tiny hesitation, was enough for Dylan to see through me. I know you do, he said softly, his eyes searching mine. I saw it in the kitchen. You hesitated then, just like you're hesitating now. I stood up quickly, needing to put space between us. Dylan, this is insane. You're my nephew. We can't do this. But instead of backing down, he stood up too, closing the distance between us with slow, deliberate steps. Aunt Jules, I don't want to hurt you or make things awkward, but I can't keep pretending like I don't feel what I feel, and I know you feel it too, even if you don't want to admit it. My hands trembled as I backed away, the living room suddenly feeling much smaller than it had moments ago. Dylan, stop. This isn't going to happen. He reached out, his fingers lightly brushing against my arm, and I froze. There was a softness in his touch, a vulnerability that made it impossible for me to move. I'm not asking for anything from you, he whispered. I just need you to know. I needed you to understand. For a long, agonizing moment, we stood there, neither of us moving, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. And then, just when I thought the tension would snap, Dylan stepped back. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I couldn't keep it inside anymore. At that moment, I didn't know what was going through my body. It was in a split second that I let my guards down and I kissed him. Now that I think back on it, I still can't put my finger on why I did that, but I feel like it's because he finally admitted it came from both sides. It was a small kiss before we paused, and after that it turned into an explosion of emotions. It felt so good, and I knew he felt the same. But then, he pushed me away. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the house, leaving me standing there, my heart racing, my thoughts spinning. The sound of the door closing behind him was like a gunshot, and I sank down onto the couch, trembling. But as much as I wanted to believe it was over, I knew deep down it wasn't. There was more to come. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Even after Dylan left, the weight of his words lingered in the air, thick and heavy. I sat on the couch for what felt like hours, replaying the conversation over and over again in my mind, hoping that if I thought about it enough, I'd make sense of it. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't untangle the mess of emotions that had woven themselves into every corner of my mind. For the next few days, everything felt off. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach dropped, expecting another message from Dylan. Every knock on the door made my heart race. I dreaded the possibility of him showing up again, yet a small part of me, one I hated to admit even existed, was almost waiting for it. Greg noticed something was wrong. He wasn't one for asking too many questions, but after a week of me being distracted, distant, and jumpy, he couldn't ignore it anymore. You've been quiet lately, Jules. Is everything okay? He asked one evening as we sat down to dinner. I forced a smile, waving off his concern. I'm fine. Just a little stressed with work, that's all. He studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly, but didn't push the issue. I felt a pang of guilt in my chest. Greg was a good man, and here I was, tangled in something I couldn't even explain to him, something that had no place in our lives. Days turned into weeks, and although Dylan didn't contact me again, I could feel his absence like a shadow, hovering just out of sight. Family gatherings became awkward. Dylan was there, of course, but we barely exchanged more than a few words. Every glance between us felt loaded with meaning, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone else could sense the tension too, though no one said anything. It was at one of these gatherings that things took a turn I hadn't expected. We were at Claire's house again, this time for a casual weekend barbecue. The weather was perfect, sunny, with just the right breeze to make it comfortable. People were scattered across the yard, sipping drinks, laughing, and enjoying the day. Greg was off with my brother-in-law again, discussing sports like they always did. I, needing a moment away from the crowd, had wandered into the kitchen to grab a drink. I thought I was alone, but as I opened the fridge and reached for a bottle of water, I heard the door creak behind me. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat when I saw who it was. Dylan. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway, his eyes unreadable. For a moment I thought about leaving, walking past him and pretending like we hadn't seen each other. But I couldn't move. Something kept me rooted to the spot, waiting for him to speak. And when he did, his voice was low, barely above a whisper. "Aunt Jules, I need to talk to you." My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Dylan, now's not the time. There are people right outside." "I know, but this can't wait," he said, stepping further into the room. "I've tried to stay away. I've tried to forget everything that happened, but I can't." I took a step back, feeling the cool surface of the kitchen counter press against my back. "Dylan, we talked about this. What you feel, it's not real. It's just confusion," I said, pretending like I didn't feel anything. "It's not confusion," he interrupted, his voice steady, unwavering. "I've thought about it every day since that night. I've been trying to figure out how to move on, but nothing works. I still feel the same." I shook my head, panic rising in my chest. "You're making this harder than it has to be. You need to move on, Dylan. This isn't right." He moved closer, closing the distance between us, his eyes full of intensity. "I don't care about what's right anymore. I just need you to understand that I love you. I've loved you for so long, and I can't just pretend that I don't." His words sent a shock through me, leaving me frozen. This was wrong. On every level, it was wrong. But the way he said it, the raw emotion in his voice, made it hard to think clearly. My thoughts were spinning, my chest tight with the pressure of everything I didn't want to feel. "Dylan, stop," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You have to stop this." I told him to stop to prevent that I would let myself go again. "I can't," he replied, his voice just as soft. "I don't want to hurt you, but I can't stop how I feel." He reached out then, his hand gently brushing against mine. I flinched, pulling my hand back, but the warmth of his touch lingered on my skin, sending a wave of confusion through me. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. "You don't have to say anything," he continued, stepping even closer. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the weight of his words, the closeness of him, the memories I didn't want to acknowledge. "Dylan, please." But even as I said it, I knew this conversation wasn't going to end the way I wanted it to. I could feel the tension in the air, pulling us together, and it terrified me. And then, just as I was about to speak again, the sound of a door opening echoed through the room, startling us both. Greg's voice drifted in from the hallway. "Jules, you in here?" panic shot through me and I quickly stepped away from Dylan, putting as much distance between us as I could before Greg appeared in the doorway, a smile on his face. "Ah, there you are. Claire's looking for you outside." I nodded, forcing a tight smile as I grabbed the water bottle from the counter, my hands trembling slightly. "I'll be right out." Greg glanced between me and Dylan, his smile fading as he seemed to sense the tension in the room. "Everything okay here?" "Yeah," I replied quickly, too quickly. "We were just talking about college. Dylan's plans for the fall." Greg looked at Dylan, then back at me, suspicion flickering in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. "All right, well, don't leave Claire waiting." I nodded again, feeling the weight of his gaze as he walked back out of the room. Dylan didn't say anything either. He just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, even though part of me didn't want to leave. But I couldn't stay. Not like this. Without another word, I followed Greg out into the yard, trying to push the entire encounter out of my mind. But I knew, deep down, that things between Dylan and me were far from over, and the story wasn't over yet. I spent the next few days in a fog, barely able to focus on anything. Dylan's words replayed in my head, and every time I thought about how close we had come to something I didn't want to even acknowledge, I felt sick to my stomach. I knew I had to put an end to this, to draw a firm line that couldn't be crossed again, but every time I tried to figure out how, the right words eluded me. One night, as I lay awake in bed next to Greg, who was fast asleep, I heard the soft ping of my phone. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. Hesitating for a moment, I reached for the phone, my heart already pounding. The message was from Dylan. "We need to talk. I can't keep going like this. Tomorrow at yours, 3 p.m. Please." I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, torn between fear and responsibility. I knew I shouldn't go. Meeting him again, alone, would only lead to more complications, more confusion. But at the same time, I knew that if I didn't go, nothing would be resolved. This situation couldn't be ignored forever. Reluctantly, I typed a response. "Okay." The next day, just before 3 p.m., the doorbell rang. My hands were clammy, my pulse racing as I scanned through the window who it was. But of course, I already knew it was Dylan. He looked tense, his shoulders hunched as he stared out at the water. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever conversation was about to happen, and opened the door. There he was, a young, vibrant, and very handsome boy. "Hey," I said softly. "Hey," he replied, while immediately stepping inside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, the weight of everything we hadn't said hanging heavily over us. "I can't do this anymore, Aunt Jules," Dylan finally said, breaking the silence. "I can't keep pretending like I'm okay, like I can just move on and forget everything." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dylan, I understand this is hard for you, but we have to move on. We can't stay in this place. It's not healthy for either of us." He shook his head, frustration and pain flashing in his eyes. "You don't understand. I can't just switch off my feelings. I've tried, and I can't, and I don't think you can either." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm your aunt, Dylan. We're family. What you're feeling isn't something we can act on. It's not just about us. It's about everyone else, too. We would destroy so much if we crossed that line." He turned his head. "I know it's complicated. I know it's wrong, but I don't care. I can't keep lying to myself." The intensity of his words hung in the air between us, and I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest. I had to make him understand that this had to stop, once and for all. We both sat down at the couch and continued the conversation. "Dylan, listen to me," I said, facing him. "I care about you. I love you, but not in the way you want me to. You have to let this go, for your own sake." He looked at me then, his expression softening just slightly, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerable boy I had known all his life, the one who had always looked up to me, who had come to me for advice and guidance. "Tell me you didn't feel anything," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "That night in the kitchen, tell me you didn't feel anything, and I'll let this go." I felt the world tilt slightly beneath me. I wanted to say it, to give him the answer that would close the door on this whole mess, but the truth stuck in my throat like a stone. I had felt something I couldn't explain, something I didn't want to admit to myself, but I couldn't let that truth slip out. It would only make things worse. I wanted to lie, but before I knew it, I told him the truth. I told him what I truly felt for him. "If I am honest, I did feel it, Dylan," I said, my voice barely audible. "It was a mistake, but I did feel the excitement through my body." His face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then, slowly, he nodded, his eyes filled with a deep desire to go back to that one moment. I could just feel it, and suddenly, I felt the same. I knew I was the person that was in control, and so I leaned into him and grabbed his chin. I kissed him once again. Once again, I was the person that started the drama. I just couldn't hold it. This time, we both didn't hold back, and we let ourselves go. As I was going with my hand through his hair, I felt something I had never felt before. It was so exciting, so wrong, but yet so exciting. And then, before I knew it, we went way further than what we had already done. It was a crazy moment, and thinking back of it, it is all a blur for me. But yet something in me craves to get back to that moment. Eventually, as we done and still both laying on the couch, I told him this was a big mistake and that we couldn't tell anybody. He told me he was truly in love and that he wanted more of it, but I told him I didn't, as I was grabbing my clothes. "Okay," he whispered, "if that's how you feel." He turned away from me, walking a few steps towards the window. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of everything he had been carrying. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but I knew I couldn't. This was something he had to come to terms with on his own. After a long silence, he finally spoke again, his voice low and resigned. "I'll move on. I'll try anyway. But I don't know how long it's going to take." I nodded, my heart heavy with guilt and relief. "You'll get through this, Dylan. You're strong. You'll find someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved." He didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there, staring out at the water, lost in his own thoughts. I waited for a moment longer, unsure of what else to say, before turning to leave. But just as I started to walk away, I heard him speak one last time, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll always love you, Aunt Jules." Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't. I walked away, leaving Dylan behind on that bench by the pond, knowing that we had both been changed by this, in ways that neither of us would ever fully understand.